Hey, so I'm here with the Go Off Queen of LinkedIn. She's got a great Substack. There's a lot of problems affecting mental health care, from structure to service delivery, a ton of things. But today is a good day because it'll all be over. We're going to talk for just a little bit, and all of the problems we're going to figure out the solution to all of those things so that they will no longer be affecting you and probably will be solved by the time you're listening to this podcast. So just an FYI, we're really excited. Can you tell me a little bit about your work? Because I don't know a ton about your history. Like, I've read your writing and I like it, but I don't know a ton about how you got there. Or maybe I missed a bio somewhere on the Substack. But
yeah, no worries. Oh, thanks for that introduction. Go off, Queen. I'm going to use that. I love that. I'm taking that.
Well, I don't know. LinkedIn used to be. It's like people trying to be funny and do a meme, but also be an HR department at the same time. And so it's just the worst types of posts usually.
Yeah.
The most broad stuff.
Stuffiness too.
Yeah. Because, which I get, you're looking for a job or you need to show that you're professional or something. But I just love sharing stuff that is kind of subversive and against that or just weird because it's I don't know. I don't really need.
I'm kind of over it. I'm kind of over trying to be super professional and in HR. That's kind of my whole angle. So, but you asked about my background. So my background is as an LMHC. I went to a KCREP accredited program in Southern Maine, where I'm from, did all the hours, all the licensure, got fully licensed. I really mostly worked in community clinics. So that outpatient, therapeutic work was my jam. Thought I would do that my entire life. I really became a therapist very young. I think I was 25 when I was conditionally licensed, and then, a little bit older, fully licensed. And that's a really hard, road to hoe, as a lot of people know when they're getting into this profession very young. And
so what year was that? What's going on?
I graduated in 2012, and I left clinical practice by 2018.
What was your training in, or were you have any observations about the field as you were coming into it at that time?
Yeah, I think I was just trying to survive it, trying to figure out what it meant to be a good, clinically sound, ethical therapist. At that time, I only had access really to being trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, some acceptance and commitment, which I enjoyed, motivational interviewing, and some of those. I didn't even have access to being trained though in DBT or any sort of EMDR or trauma informed. That was very specialized at that time. Only a few clinicians in each sort of practice or clinic even could do that work. So we can get into anywhere we want to go in this conversation.
Yeah.
That was really limiting too. I only had access to a pretty narrow scope of the evidence-based, treatments. And seeing the people I was seeing, it was well, this is only going to work some of the time. I could kind of tell very quickly that I was seeing such a broad scope of folks that I didn't really know how to help, and I was able to acknowledge that, but that's sort of the moral injury of it too, that you're just expected to treat all these people without really given the tools and the skills and the supervision and the support to actually navigate that successfully. So that was just one piece of why I kind of transitioned out of direct clinical practice. But
yeah, I remember that feeling of just terror when you're like, oh, I don't know how to conceptualize this, or I haven't heard this, and then you go and you read and you take the C and you keep I just always, but right out of school, because it doesn't prepare you. School doesn't prepare you to be a therapist. It takes a lot of other stuff.
It does. And, it takes the right environment too for years and years, I think, after school, as I consult, with clinicians all the time. And, they're mostly clinicians who are unhappy with where they are, or they're feeling burnt out. Even graduate students sometimes will reach out and just want to be okay, so what's really going to happen for me when I get up there, when I'm, not protected anymore, insulated, by the academic world. And so we have frank conversations, but, I try not to deter people, from their passion, because nobody could have deterred me from becoming a professional counselor. I was that committed to it. So that's not my angle, but it is to speak openly and authentically about what we've all sort of experienced, or at least for myself. And there's generally, one of the themes is that there is not a lot of high quality supervision. There is really no mentorship opportunities for folks.
And it's so expensive, because the people who can do the trauma therapy, my license is as a social worker. So there's kind of different humps that you have to get over, and a little bit different of a struggle than at LMHC and ALC and some of the different like counseling programs, but it's like you already have to go to school. You already have to pay all this to go to school. Then you're told, well, you can't say you do this, even though it's pretty intuitive until you have this training. A piece of paper says that. And you've got to go out and get supervision, which is just expensive to afford at all. But then if somebody actually has like a lot of clinical practice skills, well, they can already make $200-300 an hour seeing patients. So for you to see them for supervision is a pretty big cost proposition. And it's just like, everyone keeps saying like mental health crisis, let's like smooth licensure out and across states or something. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But just to be able to pay, $15,000 for a career where you're maybe going to make 30, 35, like when you're first coming out. I mean, how do you change that, reality without there being more support there than there is?
Absolutely. It's just one more piece of what makes, a lot of these helping professions kind of untenable. Like, we don't make a lot of money to begin with, and to have to come out of your own pocket to just try and get better at your craft, or just try and feel like you're doing the best you can by your patients and developing your own clinical skills. It feels really impossible, especially for folks who are not well resourced. Like, a lot of the people who are able to survive this industry are folks who have a certain level of privilege in society, right? Like, there's a lot of white women in therapy, right? Overwhelmingly female, dominated profession. And, I see that as people with just enough privilege to get themselves into, right, graduate school, to have the loans, to, do that trajectory, but not enough privilege, it seems, to actually create a lot of change from, within these structures and these systemic failures that we're seeing everywhere. So it's a really sort of, enclosed space that seems forever shrinking in terms of finding safe places for clinicians to be able to show up, be themselves, do the work, not be inundated with, high volume caseloads and the whole thing. It's just, it seems wildly untenable. And I've been out of clinical practice since, like I said, 2018. And I'm paying attention, I feel like sort of this observer that cares very deeply and is paying attention. And it seems to only have gotten worse in a lot of ways. And I think the private practice route, the entrepreneurial route, seems to be sort of the one way, right? Folks find to survive. And I think that's great. I will always support, people's autonomy to do what they need to do to get by and work in a way, that makes them feel safe and loved and supported. That's not a fix. That's actually not a solution to these systemic issues that just we continue to bump up against time and time again.
Well, and that was one of the things that I was interested in, because this has been on the books forever. So I would see like a LinkedIn post and I'd be like, oh, I want to ask a question about that. And then I would forget about it. And then I'd see another thing and be like, oh, we're going to talk about this. But you're reminding me of one of the things that you posted a long time ago, which is the structure of these practices and the ethics of that. And you're saying like, I'm open to there being like another alternative where people aren't exploited, but I don't see that. There's either these practices that take this huge percentage of your income, or you're just or you do your time, you get a lot of street cred. Now you're well known and you have a referral base and you can charge whatever you want and don't have to take insurance, but you're on your own. So like, how do you, and then there's some group practices where people split the cost of a waiting room essentially, or, the water bottle, machine getting refilled. But that it's everybody's kind of doing their own thing. And to talk about like what the future could look like, because like, I wouldn't advocate for somebody unless they just love it or that's their career path to stay in the hospital and start off making 30 and then top out maybe making 50,000 if they really like you and you do your time. But then also we have to have bigger practices. Like, it's not like we can just have everybody in private practice, doing their thing. So what does that look like? And I wonder, when you do consulting, what are structures that you see as like helpful pathways going forward to have like a more equitable mental health?
It's hard. It's really hard. I don't know that the solutions really exist yet. And what I'm interested in is people who want to have those conversations, who are actually able to say, like, these are the things that aren't working. How can we rethink that? How can we do this differently? But there's a lot of built by design oppression, right? Like, what can we really do to change reimbursement rates if, insurers and corporations are not willing to understand how that trickles down and affects our ability to make a living or to stay in these professions at all, right? There's very little it feels like we can do as individuals or even as a united collective to really work against such an enormous power differential that really does sort of dictate our ability to survive. And, you mentioned the other path, which is like the cash pay route. That's viable for a lot of people. It works for a lot of people. I think when I spend a lot of time with that, I think ethics come in there. Like, gosh, people might be going broke just for the opportunity, to spend an hour a week with me. And I know that the people who really need support are never going to be able to afford, these costs. And therapists charge what they deserve. That's not we really sort of demonize, I think, a lot of these rates that we see from therapists who are charging out of pocket. And I think that's misguided as well. Therapists are doing what they need to do to survive this industry. And if it doesn't work for them for a million reasons to contract with insurers, then they're choosing, like they're taking back their power and saying, well, this is great, and you can pay this or you can't pay this. And a lot of people are paying it, and a lot of folks are busy, and that's okay. It's not therapists' fault that the system is designed to not pay them, not appreciate this humanistic work. Which
pits them against patients too. So it's not healthy. I mean, patients take away is that the social worker is greedy or something, because they're not aware of like how these issues work.
Yeah. And it gets very taxing, right? To have to continue to explain to your own clients or patients what's happening here, like why it has to be this way. Well, insurance is very difficult to deal with. Let me talk to you about that. And then it goes into like even diagnosis and treatment stuff. Like, well, let me explain to you why I have to give you a diagnosis in order for us to work together because of insurance. So I think that's really exhausting. And like I think about potentially, if ever, to go back to clinical practice, I get exhausted just thinking about having to educate, person after person. It's not people's fault that they don't know these things, right? But there's just this whole education piece to understand.
The system's like the way that it works and the way that it makes money is based on it being too hard for you to know what your rights are to navigate any of it, that it's so overwhelming. Like people are like, well, it's the patient's responsibility to know their plan or whatever. It's like, I don't know 300 pages of my insurance plan and like when it pays for therapy where. And now there's like, these more obfuscatory like secret networks where they're like, oh, you're in network with, this insurance company, but you're not in the double special network where you actually get money for being in the net. It's like, no, you're in the network or you're not. Like, that's not, you don't know what network means. Like, there's like these 3 tiers now. Like when we had our baby, like we went to the hospital, no complications. The first one, just like in and out. And we get a bill in the mail that's like, you owe $60,000, but good news, right off with insurance, they paid $59,000, 90 or whatever. So only $30 is what you owe. And it's like, maybe like no money changed hands there. Like people look at this bill because it's a bill and the whole system is like, well, here's the fake rate that we say the insurance pays, but actually they don't get it. But then if you didn't have insurance, then this is the price. Like, it's the whole point is to make those things so murky and untransparent that you just see a big number and get scared and you're like, oh, I'm glad I have insurance. I would have been on the hook $60,000. I mean, Blue Cross didn't pay anything to Grandview. There was just part of like maybe $200 changed hands there or something for that hour of time.
Yeah, no, it's
so
great.
When people are looking at these prices and things, like they don't understand. I mean, they don't understand how any of this works by design, I think.
Yeah, no, you highlight some really important, flaws in the system, and like a lot of these numbers are completely arbitrary, right? It's a warfare, right, between hospital systems particular and what insurers are not willing to do, right? And we've been in this race for 3 or 4 decades now. It's inflating prices on one end and pretending that there's deep discounts and some sort of benefit from having these third-party arbitrators on the other end. And it's this battle and this dance, and patients and providers are lost and not heard in any of it. So yeah, you see these fake numbers. My father-in-law has some health issues, and he actually had like a VAD device implanted for his heart. And so he's had a lot of hospital stuff going on. And so he has like a not to get too specific, but he has like a permanent sort of open wound that he'll have to take care of for the rest of his life. And his coverage now says, well, we don't cover like supplies for that anymore. That's not part of your policy coverage, even though even though it's absolutely medically necessary. He will require that for the rest of his life. But insurers just get to say, no, we don't do that anymore.
After they give you the port or whatever too,
Yeah.
like,
right.
I mean, that's these permanent surgeries, we're seeing that. And I mean, by the way, too, anybody who, doesn't know a ton about this, no one else in the world does this. There's no other first world country that looks 2% like our system. Like it is one of the weirdest, most backwards things that we just continue to layer more and more weird on, instead of kind of going back to the drawing board and saying, like, this doesn't work, it's going to fall apart, let's go ahead and take it apart and figure out something sustainable now. I mean, we just keep propping up this lumbering beast of a mess. And I mean, we're like a lot of times I think the perception is that the therapist doesn't take insurance because they're like greedy or something. But I mean, there's not like an hour of therapy is not an hour of my time. It's 30 minutes charting. It's following up with everyone on your release of information sheet. It's when I got trained in brain spotting, I had $2,000 in that. It cost me $3,000 to get trained in EMDR. I think I'm about in $4,000, close to $5,000 in emotional transformation therapy training now, with the devices and the equipment and the travels. Have probably got about there. So I mean, to really keep pace with this industry that's changing pretty quickly and moving away from just cognitive and behavioral therapies into more brain-based stuff, it's very expensive. It's like another master's degree. Yeah. So that's what's built into it. Like, if I don't have the money to go to those trainings, I can't do that next year. And then how am I different from the therapists who you're coming to see me after it didn't work? We're Taproot's like the end stop for every complex trauma treatment resistant. I've been in therapy. I've tried everything. I mean, I want to have the cutting edge tools out there and be able to refer you to them, even if it's not through us. So, all that
becomes increasingly, an industry where only those who are particularly well-resourced or figure out how to do, very specific treatments. These are the only folks who really, I think, survive because it just gets so untenable. Another thing is, the high prevalence of 1099 contracts and, treating sort of the therapy profession seems more and more to be treated like sort of like this niche, almost like side hustle, this industry that's not really respected. Everyone wants to talk about it. Everyone wants to talk about mental health and how important treatment is. But when push comes to shove, so many of these companies, and private practice is its own sort of outlier, I think, compared to like what's happening with larger organizations and when you work in community mental health, and it's sort of like a safe haven for folks. And I love that. And often what I think about is, how can we pull what works for so many therapists in private practice back into these other environments that clearly are not taking any of these ideas, messages, principles into consideration when they're building these companies and these environments.
I think the two things that you run up against when you're trying to take what makes the private practice guy lean and mean and competitive, and then pull that individual knowledge into an institution. And the two things are, one, just like size. Like, when you have a really big hospital, when you have a really big anything, change kind of becomes the enemy. No matter how many courses you say, we want to improve and innovate, and please bring your suggestions and new ideas up front. Like, you can't really believe that. And you get this kind of like insecurity at the end of the like USSR imploding of like, well, that's a very good point that you bring up, except like we cannot be wrong. And like, I just had those interactions in the hospital where it was like, if you're right about this, we're going to have to go back and do so much work that we can't really do that. So just don't say that again, even though we ask you to bring up good ideas. And then the other thing is capital. I mean, that these are profit-seeking companies, and as long as that's there, then is there a difference between me keeping somebody for a long time who's really good, or just kind of kicking them out the door as soon as they can go compete against me, and then getting another person who is right out of school and maybe isn't a great therapist, but I got to employ 500 people. So what's the cost benefit for me? Why would I keep this person when I can pay that person less? So the larger places, you may get a good therapist, but if they can figure their thing out, they're going to be on their way out,
That's right. That's right. Because, and this is true, I think, for any good employee, regardless of what industry you're in, is that if you're not being treated well in your environment, good folks are going to leave, right?
Yeah.
And trust that they can find their way to an environment that supports them better. So I think that's largely, what we see. As soon as people build some competency, they get their full licensure, they realize that they can do this without being exploited or without being treated like crap or without being inundated with these caseloads that are making them literally sick. They will make plans or get to that realization where they need to go do something different.
Yeah. Well, and the colleges are different now too. I mean, a ton of the stuff, like the bigger places, the people who teach it or have all the awards or whatever, they'll say, well, I'm a therapist too, but it's like, you're really working at the student counseling center, 2 days a week or something. Like what you're doing. And I know that you're famous and you've got all these fancy doctor awards, but if you went and tried to sell this in the strip mall, it's not competitive enough for anyone to buy it. And so because of that, it's like, well, this person wrote the book or they have all the credentials that are medical, but then this other person is lean and mean and making all this money individually doing this other thing that the hospitals fundamentally can't. They're going to be the last to come around to something like brain spotting. They're going to be the last to figure out, what to do with EMDR, which they just never really figured out what to do with the research there. It's always going to be easier for them to do cognitive behavioral therapy and drugs. And so you see like the cutting edge private practice people moving in a different direction than academic psychology, which is a bad thing for the profession. Like, I don't like that that's happening when I pointed out, like, that shouldn't be happening, but it is, So many people come out of these programs being told, well, CBT is the gold standard. It's the best thing ever because it's the most researchable.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not doing a very good job bringing back our real world learning and understanding of what works in clinical practice back to academic institutions, back to teaching folks about the history and politics of this industry, right? Back to, teaching somatic, work and all kinds of things, a lot of the things that, I value now in terms of mental health and healing are not things that I learned academically, like we were saying, CBT was kind of the go-to. I think it still is. It's fairly easy to learn. It's fairly easy to train people to do. It's fairly easy to administer, not always. And it works for some people. And just sort of kind of good, like 2 stars out of 5 is like what we're getting, I feel like, in a lot of environments with what we're producing, from school programs. And it's just not working. And it's not especially not working for the clinician's mental health. Imagine, put yourself back in graduate school and how hopeful you were and all the things you are learning. And that curve from leaving graduate school to figuring out what it's really like to be sitting with all these different folks and how ill-equipped you really feel, and the lack of access you have because you're not making any money to get yourself trained up, to get yourself mentorship. I mean, it really, really, I think, causes so much internalized shame in the therapist. And I write about, that's something I write about quite frequently, is how the way that our systems are broken does produce this internalized shame, I think, in a lot of us. And it takes a lot of unlearning and peeling back those layers to really figure out, is it really that I was a shitty therapist, or did I just really never have the things that I needed? And now that I know better, I can do better, with that.
Which a lot of times for people in the helping profession is them reliving their childhood trauma that is they haven't, totally healed yet, or some role that they played with a parent. And I think that's a lot of under the negative reactions when you bring these issues up and try and get people to sit with complexity and admit that things are broken and change, is the anger of no, don't do that. Stop. Why are you doing this? It comes from that same wound that got them in the profession in the first place.
Absolutely.
They don't want to admit how broken the system is.
And
because it feels overwhelming.
And I guess thanks for saying that, because I think that's really probably gets a bit to the root of what I think we need to do together, right? We really do need to be able to sit with it to really understand, how these systems are designed, and that they're not serving us. They're not really serving our clients and our patients. And I guess maybe it's naive, but I believe that if we form enough collective voices, that there might be more things we can do to help change this trajectory. But it does feel like a very uphill battle. And I understand, that clinicians are just going to say, well, I'm just going to hang my shingle out and do my own thing, keep my head down and do the best I can with one patient. one client at a time. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do ask people to sort of pick up their head, at least from time to time, and try and take that 30,000-foot view and how can we, elevate these conversations and be aligned as a collective, and how we're really advocating for these systems to treat us all better, serve us all better.
Yeah. And I think like the LPC and the social work programs, I wish would learn a little bit from each other, because the social work ones, like it's just this huge person and environment view where you're learning about systems and power and politics and the way that wealth and power functions and the history of, the healthcare and all these things. But you don't get a lot of the clinical technique. You kind of have to pick that up later. Whereas the LPCs, like it's all psychopathology. It's all just like this diagnosis, but then it's like you can't see the forest through the trees sometimes, like there was a case at one of the hospitals with a student, and it was like all LPCs, and they asked a social worker that was one of my supervisors to like come in and see why she couldn't figure out. And she was like, they were trying to figure out this anxiety with the student who was having difficulty, and they went through it. And so she like kicked the clinical psychologist in the LPC side of the room and was like, are you uncomfortable that you're an African American, that all these people are white? And she was like, yeah. She was like, okay, well, there's the source of the anxiety that you guys have been looking for a long time, because the student didn't come from that community. She wasn't comfortable, but it just didn't occur to them, because it's like, which F code is this, man? Like, which diagnosis is it? Like, it almost they knew too much to kind of see the forest through the trees there.
Absolutely. And it's so funny you say that, because it's so true. Yeah. And I wanted it that way. I wanted to just focus on the clinical treatment of that person-centered, one person at a time. Like that was my bread and butter. And that's what I loved, but it doesn't work. We do have to have a blend of zooming out and paying attention. And it's a flawed intellectualizing of everything, right? Sometimes it's not that complicated. Like we just have to take a look around and realize, what's really going on here. But yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, I love that idea. That's a great system change idea. We need to blend what works great in social work and what works great in clinical counseling, and have some overlap there and learn from each other. I had a mentor when I was in graduate school who runs a pretty well-established private practice in Portland, Maine. And he said, one thing that social workers do awesome that us counselors don't do well at all is network and connect with each other and, create like this network of folks who are all sort of trying to champion or paying attention to the same things going on. Counselors historically have not done that very well. So, and my whole thing is like, I don't care what your letters are after your name. Like if you identify at all with like being a helper or a healer, working in healthcare whatsoever, like we can find a way to align. Yeah. And I care a lot less about what the letters are after your name as like what your values are and how we can, all show up to this conversation.
Yeah, and I think the letters and the trainings and the CEs and that I'm triple, double, extra, special certified in this thing, that that tendency feeds into the worst insecurities in the profession, and it makes such bad clinicians. I mean, like I would so much rather do somebody like bring somebody on with our collective who is like, oh, well, I read Albert Ellis and I like this about him, but I don't like that. But what I do when I get to the part where he doesn't work is I use Fritz Perls and I like Gestalt. And somebody who's read and integrated all this stuff, like that person's going to be 100 times better of a clinician than the person who's like, I've done 5 years of training in DBT. I'm DBT level 8 million, and here's all the paper. So that just doesn't tell me very much about if you're any good with a patient or if you can solve a problem that you can't solve, which is really, to me, like the trick of the profession is like you keep bumping into problems that you can't solve. And then you need to know how to solve that. Well, if you think you can do everything, you're never there, And like going back to you talking about systems and all this stuff, so many of the cures for the anxiety are when I just point out something that the person doesn't really want to admit that they don't want to feel. And it's not that there's a solution or you need a cognitive or behavioral change. It's just like, yeah, man. Like it does, it does feel like you're in a sinking cruise ship of a country, I've made it, I guess, and I'm looking at the cost of American cheese, and I'm like, what? How do I do this? Yeah. And by design, you will not hear about these problems on the news or in the paper. Like when you look at it, it's going to be like, well, actually, here's a secret reason why you're gaslighting yourself, and you have lots of money, and inflation's not real, or which bathroom and Disney movie is allowed this week, and it's this aesthetic social stuff that. Not that there's nothing to it or that we shouldn't have an opinion on those, but to take away it's a distraction from the structural failure of this place.
Yep.
And people feel that, and I'm just like, yeah, that's it. I can't say anything about it, but a lot of the way or I can't really do anything about it, but a lot of the way wealth and power works, this stuff goes back to the Bronze Age, probably not changing. How can you and your kids be okay in this world? Let's figure that out, but it's like the anxiety is created by not quite looking at the sun because it's too bright to look at and I can't do it. And when you just bring that into the room and give them permission, they're like, oh, okay, but it's us trying not to know what we know, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, and a lot of that is like bringing it back to core counseling, skills, like just being able to hold that with somebody and like not trying to fix or change. I feel like a lot of times we're always trying to fix or change. And sometimes that's the absolute last thing we need to do. Like it's holding it, it's validating it. It's saying like, you're not crazy. This is happening. Like the price of things, is going up insanely, and inflation, is out of control. And like, yeah, there are all these societal structures that are causing a lot, of mental health struggles. And therapy was never designed to be a solution for systemic failure. And that seems to be what we are all asked to do as mental health professionals, is prop up all of these, conditions that are surfacing as a result of people being really oppressed by systemic design.
Yeah.
We are in sort of, as I think everyone probably in history feels that they're living in a unique time period. And the thing that feels unique to me is how, I wrote about, the invisible power of excessive wealth last week. I think this very small number of Americans, 0.1% of all Americans is controlling the wealth of like more than half of our GDP, of all of American wealth that this country holds. And it's up to them. They're the ones that are really dictating how these systems operate, why they're so dysfunctional. There's a lot of political overlap with all of these things. Our food system, the way food is grown and manufactured, healthcare, the justice system, like all of it. It's to benefit
very, 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 very wealthy people. And if past a certain amount of capital, you make money in a recession. You're not afraid of it.
Yeah.
Why would you care if you can profit off of that,
Yeah. And I mean, all the money injected from COVID, like all those COVID relief funds. I mean, healthcare CEOs made more money than they've ever made from all that COVID.
But we didn't talk about that. We talked about how somehow people weren't working 9 months later because that little $1,500 stimulus check they got, they somehow had been able to live on that. So they just didn't need to work. It's like, man, have you can you tell me how people are paying rent, water, power, gas, and food without we need to get these people some budgeting classes, because I want to figure out how they're stretching that stimulus check for 8 months.
I kind of refuse to watch news. I've reached that point in my life. I'll read news. I like reading and information, but I really can't watch what's being.
It's a dog and pony show. It's a distraction. I mean, there's not news on the news, which is
it's not news.
A weird development.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's the digital age and the age of information that we're in, and yet we all are struggling to figure out what's real. It's causing a lot of problems. Yeah.
Well, when you've talked a lot about the kind of emotional and effect of these systems on the providers and on the patients, but practically, what kind of changes would you advocate for? Which is a big question. I mean, I'm sure that there's something against like unionizing essentially in the insurance contract. Like if you tried to go get all the therapists in Alabama to say, hey, Blue Cross, you got to raise our rates or else we're just going to leave your network, and they couldn't have no private practice people. They couldn't survive with just hospitals and big clinics. What are the kind of because you talk a lot about, you diagnose a lot of the problems with labor. Taproot was a kind of a different experimental structure to try and basically do an experiment to see if we could do a thing where labor owned the practice. But a lot of that stuff, it has to be an experiment because there's not like we have been moving in such a bad direction for a long time. Like we got to try something new. Do you have any ideas there?
So I like to talk about what I think would have worked for me better when I was practicing as a clinician, or what I think would help me stay longer, because that definitely is still a real hurt and a pain, you know, that I felt that I had to leave to just like find a way to survive, find a way to make money to pay our bills. And we own a house. And the reason we own a house is in part because I left clinical practice and found my way to make more stable money elsewhere. But there is a deep pain in me still that I had to leave. I did not want to. And I have anger and hurt and resentment. But one of the things I think would have worked really well for me, does not exist, I've never heard of this existing, is being able to see a much lower volume of people on a daily or weekly basis. I'm a highly sensitive person. I think a lot of people who are helpers and healers are intuitive empaths, you know, tend to trend towards being sensitive folks. And seeing 6, 7, 8 people every day literally made me sick. It was just too much on my nervous system. I didn't quite know that at the time, because, like, you know, when you're entrenched in that survival mode, you can't take that 30,000 foot view. You don't have time. You don't have the energy to really realize what's not working and why. And when I got to private practice, I did sort of taper down, and I found that if I was able to see 4 people a day was like a really good sweet spot for me. And especially if I work well in the morning. So like if I could see 4 folks in the morning or by early afternoon, and then, you know, be able to talk to my supervisor for like an hour or more about like all the things that was going through my mind about those sessions I just had, you know, that would have been so much better of a structure for me over the long term if I was able to do that. And then what I really think would be awesome now is if I could build in like a couple hours of writing, like creating blog post content for somebody, or something like that, you know? So having like this blended approach, I think, to clinician work, where like, yes, we're doing direct service work, but that's not the only thing, you know, that we're doing. We can change it up. And so our days can look different. You know, I think we need that variety to really feel like we still are having an art form to this practice that we're doing. I think that's really important. So I haven't seen or heard of positions like that. I think that probably would only exist in private practice, but that sort of blended model, I think if we could find a way to make that work structurally, I think it could really invite a lot of people who have left this industry for dead back to practice.
Well, and I think too, one of the things is that, like, I wish insurance would pay for 2-hour sessions, because you could see a lower volume of that. And with trauma and a lot of complex trauma and relational therapy, like, I think less therapy for longer works better, you know, but they won't pay for the 2-hour session. So the patient either is on the hook for that, and the insurance pays for the first hour. But like, why would you say, okay, you can come 7 days a week to see this therapist and we'll pay for it. You just can't come twice every 2 weeks. You know, you can come for a 2-hour session every 2 weeks. We won't pay for that, but you can come literally 7 days a week, and the claims will sail through. I mean, why?
It doesn't make sense, you know, and it's really frustrating, because now we have the data on outpatient services. We have the data that shows, and this is from like Evernorth, which is owned by Aetna, or I forget. But they did studies and showed that when people have consistent access to outpatient therapy, they get better, not just in their mental health, but also in their physical health. The volume of their claims goes down. They are less costly to manage year over year. So not just in the first year of receiving therapy, but if they receive therapy in the second year, those cost savings go down even further year over year when individuals have access to outpatient mental health services. So the proof is already there that it's extremely cost effective for managed care to be paying, almost with opening the floodgates entirely without any of this red tape at all. It would actually cost them less to manage patients, you know, financially over their mental and physical health if they just gave unrestricted access to mental health therapy. So it would literally be a win-win. There is literally a win-win that exists in this system that they are not willing to engage in whatsoever.
Well, I did business consulting before I did social work, and you'll get with the owners of these businesses where it's like they're spending all this money, but when you tell them, hey, look, you screwing this person over in this situation is actually costing you money because you're not keeping talent or whatever, it's like they can't get it. And a lot of those forces insurance is the same. It's like, I mean, you have literal research saying that this is cheaper for them, and they can't swallow the initial expense because it feels like they lost, or there's some way around that, or that profit seeking whatever. And it's like, y'all are requiring me to use evidence-based practice as the insurance company. Why aren't you using it?
There isn't any, because it's all about risk management. I've been inside. I've worked for health insurers, not super high up, but high up enough to ask difficult questions and get shitty answers about them.
Yeah.
And it's all about containing costs, because there's a quarterly earnings report that has to go out to stockholders.
That is more important than the long-term profitability of the company. The quarter.
Always.
I mean, we have these such perverse incentives.
That's what it's about.
Well, I was curious because I do think that the newer generation seems to be open to new ideas. They don't have the insecurity of like, oh, you're doing something new. Did mommy and daddy say you could do that? That I see in some of these older professionals that I butt heads with. And, so with Taproot, like my practice, like the goal of it was to be kind of, I mean, one, we wanted to be different than this kind of CBT practice and the kind of boomer, like Zen rock stacked up, gentle time. This is a safe space. And so our brand was a little bolder. It was like, yeah, we do state of the art, complex trauma and neuroscientific approaches, but also, therapy can be part of life and art and growth and cool. And it doesn't have to, you don't have to be like a hurt puppy, coming in here. Like sometimes I feel like that language keeps more people out, that we have to make, it's a safe space, but it also is like, there's something that gets a little bit performative sometimes. And so the structure of it was, that we were going to do, we don't look like a normal thing where there's the little target light and whatever. I mean, we wanted it to, because everyone was trained in brain spotting, which is very expensive. Everybody was trained in phase 2 of brain spotting. We have the QEEG brain mapping and neuromodulation clinic downstairs. We are now getting trained in ETT, which is really neat. Another brain-based medicine. And then we're one of the few places where you can get all of those with somatic and experiential models, so that everyone has at least one of those. So we kind of are building these protocols to figure out like what works better. Like we know, okay, well, if it's ASD, brain spotting may not work right away, but then with the neuromodulation, we can now use brain spotting to treat trauma, but the trauma, it has to be done in this order with a dermal condition and things. And that isn't something that you see everywhere, because people tend to just be doing one kind of therapy.
Yeah.
But then from a business perspective, I really believe that in that labor, has rights to own structure. Like I really I've gotten offers to run businesses that I turned down, because I just think the revolving door model of like, I'm going to take 60% of your income and then an extra 10 to 15% in made up fees until you can go compete against me and then leave. And then you go into private practice, and then I'll hire another one of you, and I have all the patients and people know who I am, and I'll deign to give you some for, more than half your income. Like I don't like that model. So what we wanted to do with Taproot was have a collectively owned practice where, on paper it's a 1099 contractor thing, but we take young people who that I can talk to and be like, this person knows what's up, but the hospital is not going to value you for a long time, but we'll invest in you now. And we don't make money on you for a year or 2 years. So we really need you happy. Like I'm putting myself over a barrel, because if we just spend all this money to do a designer office for you and then for personalized marketing and set you up your brand, and you just take it and walk, then I'm hosed. So we really want to keep you happy. And so because of that, we tried to be really lean and mean and to automate as much stuff as we can, and to not have like a lot of like, administrative and W-2 overhead, and work smarter, not harder. And then if we make extra money, we pay it back to the clinicians as a bonus at the end of the year. But what that did was, one, we're not all by ourselves. We're not just like, okay, well, I'm made it in private practice, so now I'm by myself. Like it actually is a functioning clinic where we all can collaborate and do these things, kind of like an institute, in a way that you can't at those other practices, because the people who are good are leaving, and then two, like people can do things like you're talking about. Like I like to write and do the podcast, which wouldn't really be a cost proposition that made any sense for me, but it fills up, it does all of this wonderful SEO that would cost $15,000-$20,000 if we went out and bought it. But I can produce content people like, and that's benefiting the other clinicians. So they understand. So I get paid for that. And then, like some of them have more administrative or networking or, whatever. And in private practice, none of those skills would get used, because there's no reason for me to continue to have a podcast. I'm already full in a year. So why would I do that? But it lets you break that up and everybody's strengths kind of shine. So I hope that collectivized thing is something that happens. But I really, really just didn't want anyone to work for me if they would make more money not working for me. There'd be no reason for that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that, because I think that's the type of innovation that we need to be looking at together, that we could invest in people who are up and coming, who have something to look forward to. Like I've heard from like a lot of clinicians I consult with, especially newer clinicians, they're like, so what's the goal here? What's my overarching goal here? Just see as many patients as possible, as long as I possibly can, until I can't do it anymore. Like that doesn't feel very good as a clinician who wants to grow their skills and get really good at something. I imagine the fact that you're using actual devices helps to destigmatize and break up some of the drone of all talk therapy, on overload, on repeat all the time. Those are some really wonderful things that you're doing there. I'm interested if you're tracking that in any way, or how you're seeing, clinician mental health sort of improve as maybe compared to other environments they're coming from.
I'm always looking for a problem. So I'm like always terrified they're going to leave, and they're like, what can we do? We doesn't like, we're happy and calm down, whatever. So, I mean, so far, nobody who's joined Taproot has ever left. But there's nothing in our contract. There's no non-compete. There's no buyout. There's no punitive, whatever. I mean, if you don't want to work here, take all the patients that you have, walk, go into private practice, and you're fine. So it puts the pressure on me and, our management to make sure that everything there is always keeping them happy and making them more money than they would make on their own. Because the second that they can, they should leave. Like if you can make more money, then not at Taproot. But we're able to bundle, very professional like billing and admin services and all of these. We have a huge professional library. Like we're able to provide trainings, on a larger scale, cheaper, because we're bundled together than anybody could individually go out and get all that stuff,
That's awesome. I think that just your lens of like empowerment, autonomy, like wanting people to learn skills that they can be self-sovereign with, whether they stay with you or not, that level of self-empowerment, I think clinicians need everywhere, far and wide. And it's just really rare to find that. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that works. I mean, so far everyone else has made more money than they would.
That's a really good
sign. But they've made more money than they would have if they had not joined. Like they made more money being a part of Taproot, but I've made less money trying to start this whole project. Like because maybe if it works out in the long run, that's a nice thing to have a piece of. But in the short term, I mean, it's been like an investment. It's not something I'm not making what they're making.
So it's still experimental for you. Yeah.
But I think that we're going to have to run those experiments, and we've learned a ton about how to be leaner. Like you look at our overhead and what we're able to provide with what we spend based on practices that are 4 or 5 times our size. Like they should able to be leaner
this is something I've heard too, that practices could operate on leaner margins than they do. And that's why, even in these group practices or private practices, there can still be exploitation that exists unnecessarily. I didn't really know that until I started talking to some practice owners who were like, we can offer like an 80-20 split and still be totally cool.
Yeah.
On our books. And
especially when you're a teletherapy firm and you're not even the rent and all of that. I mean, because if anyone's not familiar with the market, like the way that, there's W-2 practices that act like they're God's gift to paying you $30,000 or something. Yeah. And then there's these 1099 contractor practices where you're your own company, but they're going to refer and manage for you. But they pay you, usually about 60% of what you make, but then you never actually get that in practice at a lot of the firms around here. Some are better than others, but the ones that like me and my friends have worked at, it was like, oh, you didn't lock your notes on a Sunday when you didn't have any notes to lock, but you didn't hit the lock button. So that's 5% fee, and just it's just stuff designed to scam money because that's how they make money. And they don't care if you leave, and it's in your contract. And if you want to leave early, you got to pay me and buy out of it. And so, on paper, we are a 1099 contractor practice. Like we're all individual companies, but the structure is more to protect them and let them run it. And everyone gets a piece of what the whole total project makes at the end of the year. So you're incentivized to take some time to learn how the QEG works, help set up a referral stream for them so that more people in the community know about it because you get a part of it. And the hope is that, everybody is able to make more together than we ever would have individually. And
Yeah. Yeah.
content creator, being like a thing that a lot of therapists do it when they start, but then they stop because they're full and they don't need to get their brand any bigger. But because we're all writing articles and doing podcasts and contributing, like we could have an online store where we sell wellness products. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do with our national reach now that they would all kind of have a part of. And I think those kind of collective structures are things we need to work on. But collectivism doesn't mean everyone's doing the same thing. It means you find people with the skills you need and share it.
Yeah, it almost means the opposite to me. Like the collective means like we're maybe generally all trying to push the ball forward, but in a variety of different ways, like this is an experiment for you. And I'm sure you, like you said, you've gleaned so many insights from this. How else are we supposed to move, our professions forward if we're not trying new things, So yeah, I really like that. And, I talk a lot about 1099s, and I don't mean to suggest that it's not a good thing. I think if there's value there, like you've obviously built a lot of value into what you're offering to clinicians, and they know that up front. And so that's a symbiotic relationship. If that works, I love that. But what I see is a lot of these bigger companies saying, well, we can't afford insurance premiums, so here you go. And we're still going to tell you that you need to do CBT with all your clients, and you have a caseload that is way too much for you. And you know what I mean? So 1099s can go a different route, but they're
usually kind of exploitive, a way to turn the profession into gig work, which is what they're trying. I mean, that's what's scary to me is you look at like something like BetterHelp, that the lefty good guy on the podcast is saying mental health awareness, and then they roll their sponsored ad for BetterHelp or something. And it's like these companies that want to reach across state lines and say that they're the same as therapy and all of that. I mean, that seems like the scariest thing for me, is somebody trying to turn, social work into Uber, basically.
Yeah. And with AI, literally, they're already trying to replace, the work of human connection with AI. And there's lots of things AI can be leveraged to do, but I don't think we should start with replacing therapeutic work. It doesn't seem like that'll really work out in the long run, but people are trying to do it.
Well, and a lot of those companies, it's kind of icky, and what they do is because they'll say, this is therapy on their YouTube ad. But then when you go through your paperwork, this is a licensed therapist, but they're not doing therapy to you. So they're bypassing all of this. And she's going to read the terms of service, 30 pages or whatever.
Right.
But they're bypassing all of this legislation. And they're not providing therapy, but they're for some reason advertised that
they're advertising it as that. Yeah, there's a real lack of oversight. I mean, and it's hard to even keep up, with the lawsuits and the litigation that is coming out, but people have to keep blowing whistles. I have a real affinity for whistleblowers because a lot of times we don't know about any of this horrible shit until it really sees the light of day. And that's one of the other things I try and write about too. Like, keep speaking up, even though it feels scary and hard. Like, if we create collectives where it's safe to do that, the more we can speak out and try and say that this is not okay. A lot of it is like clinicians taking back, in some ways, ownership of what it means to be a therapist, of what it means to do therapy, what therapy is, not allowing like all these corporations just come in and bastardize it and cut it down into little parts and sell it off. That's not what any of us came to do.
Yeah, but I mean, that takes some political will and some like desire to actually regulate. Like when BetterHelp sold people's Facebook, and when they sold Facebook therapy notes illegally, which if one provider did that, they would be out of practice. They wouldn't have a license. But for some reason, when you do it with 4 million people, it isn't an existential threat to your existence, or even that inconvenient. They got fined less money than they made selling the data. So that's a huge failure of regulation that I don't really see right, left any outcry about.
Yeah. And it happens. And they even plan for that. Well, they know they're going to have to pay a fine, but they know that it's less than, the payout. So
yeah,
there's a lot of darkness in this industry. And, I try and balance calling it out with having hope. I think that's important to not just talk about how terrible and bad it feels sometimes, but that there is hope, and highlighting people's stories and who's trying to do it right and who's trying to experiment and do new things and keep people in this industry, in this profession, because God knows all of us need helpers and healers in the world. So it can feel like
I think like the speed of, there's these kind of post EMDR things that are just really quick, like ETT and brain spotting especially. I mean, where I see those kind of empowering the profession is that they're just so fast. The cost proposition isn't that much for the patient, even if you charge $300 an hour, because they can get better in a month in things that used to just take years. It's not an intuitive therapy idea, It's more of a neurological,
Uh-huh.
kind of weird thing. And I mean, you're looking at pupillometry and stuff, and those things just work for PTSD in weeks, and what really used to take years, even with very good therapy.
Yeah.
Because it's not talk based. I mean, it's kind of operating somehow directly on the brainstem and basal ganglia, and like
Yep.
there's some exciting new stuff coming. I wish it was more available.
I do too, and that's wonderful. And I think we have to be willing to think beyond talk therapies, right? I think that's where we start, but like we have to be willing to just sort of figure out what else works. I think a lot of us are not willing to say how little we truly know about the brain, just like where we are in society, in evolution. Like there's so much undiscovered that we know about the brain and what helps and what heals, and it's very individualized. But I think it's super exciting that folks with, licensed clinical social work backgrounds can find their way to learning these specific skills with brain mapping and bringing people like neurologically essentially based treatments that can help them like heal some really severe symptoms in a really short amount of time. I mean, that's incredible. And I agree. We need to have those accessed in more places and be more widely available. I think one of the worst things we do is get so focused on our little niche that we don't want to pay attention to how the field is growing and all these new things that are happening. And so one of the things that has worked really well for me is to not become too fused with whatever it is that I learn. I always want to learn more, and just like keeping that really piqued curiosity about what else is out there, what else could work. I think that's really sort of a recipe for growth when you're willing to sort of keep your head up at what else is out there and not just only be focused on the things that we have been trained.
Well, I think the traditional hierarchies are as damaging for the people on the bottom of the totem pole than they are on the top. Like, the thing is, like, I don't know how all of that stuff works. I mean, Jay has 2 PhDs. Deanna is an electrical engineer PhD. I mean, they run that neurostim stuff. Marie does things that I don't know. She's got trainings that I don't know. I mean, if it feels like, oh, well, I want to have this practice and everybody needs to do my same kind of therapy and I need to be the expert and they have to come here and they'll learn from me. And then after they've done their time, I'll kiss the ring and now they're the whatever. Like I don't want to hire people who only do worse versions of what I know I want to hire people who are smarter than me, because that's what has allowed us to provide things that I can't alone and to discover things that I couldn't by ourselves. And we have so many protocols and integrative methodologies now that don't exist anywhere, just because we were willing to get out of our comfort zone and be curious and get a bunch of people who were knew things the other person didn't and weren't insecure about that together in one space.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that might be the future, right, of where this is all headed, is that we don't just exist in silos as professional counselors and social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists, but that we do have these blended approaches where we're going multidisciplinary and we're figuring out, how can we pull from all these different fields and really sort of get that holistic view on how to help people in really innovative ways. Sometimes they're like ancient ways and sometimes they're strikingly innovative ways, but like, how can we take a really holistic approach? So that's really cool what you're doing. And I suspect that those types of approaches will continue to grow. Hopefully.
Yeah, I do. I mean, when we opened Brain Spotting, there were 2 providers in the state almost, and now there's like more than 50 just in our zip code. So I mean, in 3 years, it's really blown up because the market demanded it. And patients don't pay for things that don't work for a long time. They don't recommend things that don't work to their friends.
That's great. Yeah. Congratulations on that kind of growth. That's really impressive.
Well, I mean, we don't have the 50 providers. We're a 5-person practice, but I just mean that like we brought it here and it kind of fueled demand and people heard about it, and that's great. And I hope ETT is the next thing to go that direction. The QEEG brain mapping stuff is, I mean, that's another issue, is like you bump up against the market where it isn't educated yet. And there's like 20 competing technologies in that sector that all have different pros and cons, but they range from like snake oil to like well-intentioned, but doesn't work as good as this other one, to like really good. But the people are all calling all of those brain maps or neurofeedback or neurostimulation. Like they're making a distinction. So a ton of the time when somebody says, oh, don't do that, I did it and it was a waste of money. Well, you did it on a $20 Brookstone machine. You're just calling it the same thing as this $30,000. Or a lot of them are protocol driven, where there's not somebody interpreting the brain map. They're just like, oh, ADHD, click. Well, your ADHD looks different than mine, So that I think those are the market knowledge is kind of an obstacle too.
Yeah, it's a learning curve, right? I feel like that happens especially when there's new treatments, right? There'll always be people, maybe not necessarily bad actors, but people who are going to try and like jump in and do that work without fully understanding it, or, without being really adequately trained, or, having the supervision or mentorship that they need to really learn it well. So that's a real deterrent in our industry too. Some people are really, really focused on delivering high quality clinical care, and there's a lot of deterioration from that too. And that causes a lot of infighting and a lot of chaos. And it's like, gosh, well, like what patients are going to trust us if we can't even have like public discourse and talk about, what really works, or the high quality ways to approach these interventions. So
that is something that's always funny to me, is you see all these like medical conspiracy theories now, or conspiracy theories about therapy, where they're like, oh, all the therapists go to this conference and they're, doing to work this political end or this whatever. You just see all this conspiracy stuff, and it's like, man, if you've ever been to a conference where people are presenting research, like they are all fighting. Nobody agrees with anybody. Like, open an academic journal, it's all just like clapbacks, and like to act like you have this consistent cabal that could be motivated to get along at all is just.
I wish we were organized enough to do something that powerful.
Yeah, trust me. Yeah, that we are not good enough at. We're not good enough at just furthering evidence-based practice, let alone being the Blizzard people or whatever.
Fact. Yes.
Well, is there anything we don't get to that you want to talk about with your work or perspective on everything? Or I try to touch a little bit on everything you write about.
No, thank you. I feel like I could talk to people for hours, especially fellow therapists, especially people who are in practice, about the flaws and the struggles. But it really does fire me up to hear people who are doing things their own way, and they're having at least some success with it, or they're enjoying it. They want to stay in the field. I want everyone to want to stay in this field. That's why I write, and I'm turning around and trying to shine a light on all these dark spots. It's not because I hate the industry or I'm just a resentful, angry person. It really is because I want more therapists to find and build the places where they can really stay and do the work. And it didn't work out that way for me. Maybe it could in the future. I don't know. But I want us, like, especially the people who leave or have been just really morally injured, like the people who didn't find their way to stay. I really want us to turn around and to spread light and to talk about why it didn't work and what could be different and how to keep this industry going and alive, because we got a lot of passionate people who are really intuitive healers who really could make a tremendous difference in this world. So those are the things that I write about. I could talk about it forever, but it was such a pleasure to learn from you, Joel, and all the good work that you're doing. The only thing I really have to plug is my LinkedIn, where I write, Brittany Lindsey on LinkedIn. And I also have a Substack where I write in longer form, which is brittany.substack.com.
Yeah, I think when I first wrote you an email, I called you like Lindsey Brittany, like I reversed them.
That happens all the time.
Yeah,
all the time.
Well, and then some places they switch it automatically, like some online directories and things. So then it's doubly confusing. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful speaking to you, and I hope everybody comes and enjoys your writing. I think one of the issues that a lot of times your stuff comes through very clearly, that you have hope for the profession and that you're wanting it to improve. And a lot of times when there's more of like a whistleblower or kind of a critical analysis, people, their takeaway is that the person's just angry and they want to complain, or that they're saying the thing about the system because they just feel bad or something. And there is a personality and perspective in your writing that makes it clear that these things are not good, and that we need to admit the gravity of the problem and be adults and do that and not avoid those truths, but that also they are overcomable and they are things that would benefit us if we were able to do that.
Thank you. Yes, a lot of the problems that we face are very fixable, and that's, I think, one of the important takeaways is that if we can be united, if we can shed light on this, if we can, do what we need to do as a collective, that maybe we can incite this fixable change that we know is so needed. So I'm going to keep writing and doing what I can do to that extent, and appreciate being in community with you as you do the same.
Yeah, well, good luck, and thank you for your work. It's important, and if you look at people like Yalom or people who like write a ton, so much of their influence on the profession comes like almost after the heyday of their practice, because you have the next generation reading the work, and then that's the people who are 13, 14 now, reading your stuff. may end up becoming the next generation, because it spoke to them, and younger people are generally a little bit better at being able to admit when the system doesn't work, or just because we've done the tradition forever, maybe we should stop.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so excited by young people. Each new generation moves us forward. So I'm always excited to see what young people are going to do next. And if the work that, we're doing, the writing that I'm doing now, even plays a small part in influencing that for the better, then it will all have been worth it.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And please go check out Lindsey's Substack. She's got some nice stuff, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Joel.